Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate it at the table. I'm Nathan.
I'm Lex.
I'm Holly.
And I'm Tyler.
Hello?
Tyler has run Aliens for Into the Darkness for us. We just finished up Destroyer of Worlds a few months back, as well as being a author
Get
for
me
Call
outta
of
here.
Cthulhu. I believe I saw your work in Fear's Sharp Little Needles as the most recent time I saw it. So, with his expert advice, let's see what's on the slab. The case report for this session is Chariot of the Gods, which is a scenario written by Andrew E.C. Gaska for Alien, the role-playing game. You can find it in the Alien starter set. In this cinematic scenario, a crew of space truckers investigate a distress signal in deep space. From there, nothing bad happens and everyone gets home safely. As with any dissection, we'll be discussing all the gross innards of the scenario, so from this point on, there will be spoilers. So if you're interested in playing this scenario, please stop here and share this episode with your GM so they can listen and consider running this for your group. We'll also include links for where you can purchase a copy of this scenario for yourself in the show notes of this episode. Now with that out of the way, let's begin our dissection. So, what's the general setup for this? This is a pretty basic sort of scenario, right? Distress signal brings people out.
Kinda. So, the player characters are part of the USCSS Montero, which looks a lot like the Nostromo from Alien 1. They are going about what they think is their business as usual, awakened from cryo, with the purpose of delivering a shipment of some kind of valuable chemical to Sutter's world for Weyland-Yutani. Once they check their star maps, they find that they are nowhere near the planet and in fact have been rerouted in their sleep to check out a distress beacon from the Cronus, which is actually a Weyland Corporation vessel that was sent to some kind of far, uncharted world to do some research. The crew of the Cronus encountered some kind of xenomorphic vector, a lot like the spores and black ooze and things from the engineers, similar to what we've seen in Prometheus and in Alien Covenant, and brought it back on board with them to study. As you can anticipate, all hell broke loose on the Cronus. They flew like bats out of hell off of this planet, jettisoning their science lab and generally suffering a lot of damage before the science crew tried to inoculate themselves against these spores and then lock themselves into cryo to hopefully be found and rescued. The crew of the Montero are that unwilling rescue party.
One thing that I think a lot of people get confused about or inevitably are going to ask is when this scenario takes place compared to all the other movies. And unfortunately, that's not easy to find within the scenario. So I did a little bit of research. The scenario takes place somewhere between 2183 and 2185, which, to put it in perspective, Alien, the first Alien movie, took place in 2122, so it's about 60 years later. And then Aliens took place in 2179. So it takes place a couple years after Aliens.
Yeah, I did find myself wondering that as I was reading and then just never got an answer about it. It's like, when is this all taking place? So that's good to know, Tyler.
The future, TM.
Yeah, that's a little surprising considering they do have such a timeline in the rule book that they have there. You'd think they'd kind of tag it as this is where the starter scenario begins.
I'm trying to flip through because they do mention that the Cronus has been missing for, oddly,
75 years.
Yeah, three-quarters of a century. You could just say 75 years. But that it was launched around like 2110.
2110.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this may go into stuff that we're talking about later. The format of the scenario, I love Free League stuff. I love, Alien role-playing game. I don't think that this is the best laid out scenario from like a GM perspective. I think, and this is just a theory of mine, I think the reason is because it was written by Andrew E.C. Gaska. This, I think, was his first scenario that he wrote. I could be wrong on that. He did an interview with Miskatonic University podcast back in, I think, 2018 or 2019, where he was talking about the Alien role-playing game, and I barely remember him saying that. So This could also be just, an artifact of, he was a novelist beforehand, trying to translate those
Yeah.
skills to, role-playing game author and scenario author. They don't always go one to one. And so there's some information in there that would have just been nice. You could have just had it in a call-out box somewhere, and it's just missing.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you bring that up. And I was about to say, if this is his first scenario, this is damn good.
Like,
and then you said he was a
debut, right?
novelist. Like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, no. Because that was a comment that I had that I absolutely agree that from a GM perspective, the scenario was laid out very differently than anything that I had seen before. However, I don't hate it because especially so much of the scenario is dependent on what areas of these massive ships that you are in. So being able to just have the sections are really well laid out by room make a lot of sense, but it just will involve a ton of page flipping back and forth. I think it may be helpful at a physical table, but yeah, I would want to rewrite everything, as you said, for myself to keep myself oriented.
Yeah, and again, not to jump ahead, but that's when I ran it, that is exactly what I did. I mean, I know this is a podcast, so nobody can see me lifting this up, but this is the I printed it off, and then
The guest is raising a book up in front of the camera.
It has
bookmarked
many
everything.
little bookmarks.
So that's really smart, though, honestly.
And then I even had to actually go in and just like what you said, Lex, I went through and just kind of made notes of every room. This is what's in it, just kind of bullet point out just so I could easily reference that.
Yeah. So this comes within the starter set. And I think Free League has knocked this and the Blade Runner starter sets out of the park for in-person games because there is a giant, nice map that you can use. There's tokens you can have your players move across on the maps to indicate where they're at because it's hard to keep track of everyone. And there's cards to hand out for different things. Really, really great physical setup all around. But I would really have preferred a GM facing map, at least within the book, like you mentioned, Tyler, because I'm going to have to litter this thing with sticky notes for like, this room's dangerous, this room has spores. And also putting those sticky notes everywhere to flip between the different NPCs, motivations, so on and so forth. It'll be an exercise in bookkeeping.
Let's talk a little bit off of that as we swing back of the key locations in this scenario, right? You're going to have maps for the Montero, which is the player's ship, and the only one they'll ever need to use
Absolutely.
until they get crashed into by the Cronus, which is highlighted in the bit of like straight up they need to make a piloting roll,
Right.
or this other ship will crash
Literally
into
crashes
them,
into
which is
it.
yeah, which is cool. I like that kind of action of that. We're in the wrong place. This is weird. Hey, that distress signal is approaching very rapidly, huh?
And I think so. One of the overall strengths of Alien, in my opinion, is that the system is so cinematic.
It is.
And it's anything that you describe immediately channeled into the movies in my mind. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more later. But I feel like being able to blend some of the events in your introduction, it will involve just kind of setting them up for almost a cutscene type effect. But as your players are, in the galley introducing themselves, they get an alert that there's an approaching vessel that would bring them up to the front. And then they'll find, well, there's nothing out there on the sensors. Check the stars. The stars are wrong. And then as they're out looking around on the stars, you can describe that there's this void, this gap. And something from Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes that I loved is they're trying to find this ghost ship that has no power and isn't really showing up on sensors, so they need to visually confirm its presence. They can look around all over, but it's until they look below them, because people that are used to being on Earth don't think to check underneath them if something is approaching, and that's where this massive vessel's going to be threatening to hit them, almost like a whale underwater.
Nader will always get you.
Oh, yeah. But I think that that could be a really fun startup to this. Getting back into the cinematic thing, as Nathan mentioned, the only ship that the players will need is the Montero, which is deliberately similar to the Nostromo from the first Alien movie. I think this is great because not only is there a map that you can use, fucking watch the Alien movie, and then you have all the details. Just sit there with a notepad and take note of environmental cues. It's slightly different because it's not as big. Who cares? And then the Cronus, which is this giant dead whale of a ship that is threatening to crash into them, is deliberately similar to the Prometheus from the Prometheus movie. So that's also another one that you can rewatch that if you so choose and take notes of at least the layouts and different things and then make everything a lot worse. Kind of Silent Hill it a bit.
And I do appreciate the pretty comprehensive maps that you're given for all of these locations as well. Something that I don't think we've mentioned yet is that there is a third ship that is an optional thing to be brought in, the Satillo. Satillo? Satillo?
Satillo. I'm not going to use it, so go for it.
Let's call the whole thing off.
But there is a third ship that is an optional plot point to be brought in as well.
And you have a map for that ship that is approximately 1 centimeter by 2 centimeters in the very top of the end of the book.
Hey, well, and that's an interesting point too. I think it's the Montero. It has a secondary ship on it called the Daisy, which is basically like what is it, like a transport ship?
Right. Yeah.
I was thinking a space skid loader. Yeah.
Yeah, essentially. But there's no maps for it. There's nothing. It's described, very briefly, and it can actually be a pivotal thing within the scenario that, depending on how the players decide to go or use it. And there are people who have created maps or
nice.
images of it online. So you can, just Google it and find a good picture of it, but there's no pictures of it. And this is one of my complaints about Alien in general, because I've seen this in multiple of their Alien products. They don't always show pictures of the ship. They show like a silhouette of the ship.
Yeah.
The problem with that is it's a black silhouette against a slightly less black background. So it's really hard to see.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about this game has a 3-act structure. And I think most of the Alien ones are set up that way, where they're intended to be that way. And Act 1 is probably a little bit more structured and scheduled of here's what happens. But let's talk through what these events are. Holly, you want to take us through that?
So there are quite a few mandatory events as well as optional events, which we can definitely get into a pacing discussion later. But basically, from a mandatory perspective, the crew is woken up from cryo sleep. They discover they are not where they're supposed to be. Rather, they discover the Cronus, an additional ship that's sending out a distress signal, and the mother reminds them that they must investigate and get to the bottom of that, which also plays in with agendas.
That's something also, just as a note, which in reading, they don't emphasize it, but something that I think could be important for player motivations. It's like, why should we even go here? As soon as Mother logs that they're on the Cronus, there is now undeniable proof that they were there.
Yeah.
It's not just a question of listening to the captain.
Well, and if your players, correct me if I'm wrong, Tyler, if your players are hesitant, I believe Mother tells them that they will lose pay if they don't go investigate. Yeah.
Yeah, it pulls it directly like what was said in the original Alien movie, that they're required by the company to go and check this out, otherwise they lose all their shares.
Right.
So, even if you don't, and plus, one of the PCs is a Weyland-Yutani officer or whatever they are. Their job is to remind the PCs to do this. You're still employed by Weyland-Yutani, you want to get paid, you need to go check this out.
Right. And I mean, that's not uncommon in sci-fi, that, kind of an overarching law of space travel is that because everything is so far apart from each other and would take so long to get, like, everyone is like legally obligated to investigate distress signals, because you could almost be sentencing a crew to death if you didn't, because of like distance and time and travel and things like that. So like, you can always play that up too. Sorry, getting away from us. Okay. So the crew boards the Cronus. There are various indicators that they can be given, environmental cues that something has clearly happened here, something that has gone terribly wrong. But a mandatory catalyst is that the Cronus crew is awakened from cryosleep, and one of them dies pretty soon after, horrifically, by a bloodburster that then attacks the PCs. And PCs interrogating the crew members of the Cronus will get a pretty heavily edited version of what they were doing during their mission and what happened. But again, that'll be pretty edited, especially by their company representative, who doesn't want to give a lot away and is playing her cards pretty close to the chest. And I think right at the Act 1, Act 2 swap, the Montero is then intentionally destroyed by its mother.
And when we say mother in this case, it's like MU slash
Yeah.
TH
Sorry, if
slash
you're
it's the
unfamiliar,
computer
it's
system.
the AI that runs all of the ships.
Right. But in the classic sort of sense, it's decided that the only way to make sure that the players bring this ship back is if the Montero is destroyed, which seems like a really interesting chain
Yeah.
of thought
I think
process.
it's I
But
think it's a
love it.
directive though. Like it's a Wayland-Yutani directive that
Yes.
forces it to destroy the Montero. I do think that one of the agendas that should start pinging your players that something is up with Mother, with the directives from Wayland-Yutani, is that the lowest priority, I believe it's the company representative, the lowest priority on the company representative's agenda is to save the crew of the Cronus. That is their lowest priority. It's like, damn, that's brutal.
Some real Delta Green shit right there.
But it should at least hint to, well, at least one of your players that like that there are greater agendas at play here, and that, human life is the lowest priority.
And I like too that if we're talking about this being an alien movie, you really stumble across Ripley and the others, right? Like you're not the crew from Alien, they are.
Right, yeah. Oh, that's a really good point.
So you kind of join into this, and then yeah, everything starts going horribly wrong and different than the movie.
Yeah.
And not to get away from the key events, but that's another strength of the scenario is the way that the agendas are written, because you have multiple agendas going on that change throughout the scenario, and this allows it actually helps the GM. Speaking of from the perspective of having run it, there are certain mandatory events that need to happen. Like the Montero is going to explode. That's how you kind of force the PCs to get on the Cronus and stay on the Cronus and move into the second and third acts. But there are agendas that some of the PCs may just kind of do that for you. I've seen that happen in a couple of APs that I've listened to, and that actually as a GM, that's very helpful because maybe the Lucas player, you can kind of put it in their ear that hey, or the Wilson player, the company executive or officer, put it in their ear that hey, that everybody else is saying we're not going to do this. Oh well, maybe if something happened to the Montero, and then they may do it on their own. I think Holly, you had mentioned there's always a possibility that the PCs may not want to go on to the Cronus. They may say forget the credit. We'll lose money, whatever. Maybe there's a little bit of a agreement between the players and the GMs that they're going to go over, but maybe they don't do that. Well, if you have the Montero start to self-destruct, then they have no choice, and that's another one of the ways to get them over there.
And I think breeding that mindset of paranoia too, because you can absolutely have either Lucas, the hidden android, or Wilson, the company agent, that could hang back and Wilson will be the first one to be blamed for the Montero blowing up. The players don't have easy access to learning that it is actually Mother that detonates that as part of the Order 966. So that can be a great way that like the ship blows up, everyone is going to start pointing guns at each other. Who did this? Who sabotaged the ship?
I think the scenario even says that they can see that it was sent, the self-destruct was set intentionally, but there's no way to figure out who set it or how it was set.
Which is a great narrative point.
Mm-hmm.
So like kind of going from that point where the Montero is destroyed, and please interrupt me if I feel like I've interpreted this incorrectly, but it feels like at that point it's kind of a chaotic rolling downhill until the end of the scenario, in which like the NPCs start attacking the player characters because they've been infected. The neomorphs and the various iterations of the aliens start attacking the PCs. But
not quite, in my opinion. I think that this has a pretty slow ramping build up for Act 1. And then towards the tail end of Act 2 that's when you really get into that snowball that you're talking about, Holly. It doesn't take up a lot of narrative room in the book itself, but I do think that there will be a significant amount of time that players are going to need to spend because they need to take several shifts of work to
repairing
repair the
ship.
air scrubbers, to
Yeah.
repair the comms unit. So I think there will be kind of that empty, desolate ship that they need to get through first before everything goes haywire.
Yeah, and the opportunity to kind of get to the bottom of what happened here, maybe potentially.
Well, and a big point too is there's two different infections going, right? There is
Sure.
the neomorph infection, which is the spores that result in the bloodbursters. We'll talk more about them later, but that's kind of your classic alien, sprouts out, has that long head, it skitters around, everybody freaks out. But there's also the Draconis based antidote to these aliens, which of course turns people into a different kind of monster. Uh, Potentially, I think they say there's like a 95% chance that it's fine, but it sure seems like most of the
Yeah.
crew can get changed. So I don't know about those numbers.
Yeah, well, there's a 95% chance that it kills the bloodburster.
Ah,
But the after effect is there's a certain percentage chance that you then turn to an abomination.
Mhm.
yes.
And
Capital A.
Oh,
right.
I think I kind of misinterpreted that in the rules, interestingly. I thought it was like 95% chance it'll all be okay.
It's again, this is what I think one of those things with the scenario where I'm not going to say it's poorly written because it's not, but you have to hunt for this information.
Right.
You know,
I'm
it's not
control
in
Fing
a
right now. Yeah.
right. Yeah, it's not in a place where it would be easy to find. And some of these like key points are just in like a random sentence in the middle of a paragraph somewhere. So there's definitely a layout issue with it. But fortunately, it's not a huge scenario. It's very easy to go through in, an hour or two. So, or I mean, to read through, I mean.
I don't know. I guess I can say I've been playing too much Delta Green because I didn't even know it is the layout issues. I'm just used to it now.
And getting into the optional key events,
Mhm.
there are a lot of heavy hints in the very beginning that something is very wrong before the bloodburster makes its very cinematic appearance. And those are all optional and really down to the GM for how much you want to build that slow growing terror versus like something immediately starts stalking. So yeah, it's kind of up to GM discretion, and I would love to hear Tyler's thoughts on pacing in a minute. But even in the second and third acts, a lot of the optional stuff is just how hard you want to hit players before you hit that like snowballing roll of like everything is panic, everyone is dying, everyone is chaos. So
And then the Sotilla shows up so that everybody can get away safe and sound.
I that's probably the biggest optional thing, and I totally forgot to mention it. So good catch.
No, it's called out as optional, and it seems, Tyler, I think you have probably some opinions on this of just how optional it should be.
Yeah, and so here's the interesting thing. So when I prep for a scenario, like when I ran it for Into the Darkness, I'll read through the scenario, I'll make my own notes, but I'm also listening to actual plays. And there's lots of videos online of tips and tricks for running this. I think Seth Skorkowski came out with one, and there's a couple others. Um, Almost every single one says, "Don't use this," or "I've never used this," and the I'm glad it's an optional encounter because I feel that it's and this is just my opinion. I feel it's put in there for two reasons. The first one is if at that point, you're in Act 3 and you want to keep playing, but a lot of the PCs have run up because you have a finite number of PCs, some of which who are infected with this with the Draconis strain. This gives you some new PCs with new agendas to kind of bring in and kind of refresh for the players. And the second reason I think this is in here is because you have to look at, who they're trying to bring into this game. And this is most likely going to be a lot of people's first scenario if they're just starting with the starter set. And so you could be getting players from other games like D&D or I don't know, where it's kind of expected that they're almost like superheroes. They're going to survive. That you're going to have a happy ending. And all of us coming from horror games, we know that a happy ending is usually not going to happen. And so this kind of gives the players or the GM that option to have that kind of semi-happy ending to almost make it like the end of Alien where, Ripley gets away, which if you don't throw in the Sotelo, in my opinion, there's a high likelihood that they're not going to get away.
And that seems to be a trend with this whole section, the what do they call it? The Draconis Strain Saga. I don't think they expect characters to make it from one to the other.
No. So this is the first of a trilogy. So it starts with Chariot of the Gods, then goes to Destroyer of Worlds, and then to Heart of Darkness. They're all related by the Draconis strain, but there's nothing that makes you have things, jump from one to the other. This is a plug to watch the Destroyer of Worlds, actually both Chariot of Gods and Destroyer of Worlds from Into the Darkness, because we had a surprise to kind of tie them two together, which was really cool. I'm not
A
gonna
really fun surprise too.
Yeah, I'm not gonna reveal what it was, but you can do it. And they are tied together, but it's just very loosely.
Yeah. All right. So what is the beating heart of this scenario? I mean, from my vantage point, this is a classic alien sort of movie, right? As you have space truckers versus corporations and aliens, and the aliens are probably the less bloodthirsty of the two.
For me, it's just like that slow march toward an inevitable death. Just a relentless creature that hunts you. Everyone's working against you, and it's just an entirely unwinnable situation.
For me, what really draws me to this scenario is this notion of fearful exploration that is really going to characterize Act 1 and most of Act 2, as the players are going to be forced to navigate a cold, quiet, dark, and dangerous ship that something clearly terrible has happened here. They're forced to explore, they're forced to repair it, knowing that there are other things on this giant ship with them that they just can't find.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think another really good, I don't know if you'd call it a strength, but this is, in the starter set, it's meant to be an intro scenario to both the Alien role-playing game and the Alien universe. And I think it does a really, really great job of doing that. If somebody who came into this had never seen any of the Alien movies, or knew nothing about it, you get a lot of information here that kind of introduces you to just how deadly the universe is, how deadly the role-playing game can be, and introduces you to the aliens themselves. I think a really great example of this is the Cronus is not a Weyland-Yutani ship. It is a Weyland ship because Weyland-Yutani did not exist when it was sent out. And so the executive that wakes up does not know that Weyland-Yutani has been combined. And so you can kind of introduce that a little bit of lore in there if you wanted to kind of help people understand or just kind of give them these little tidbits of the history that just kind of I think helps flesh it out a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, especially comparing Clayton with Wilson, as Clayton is still inarguably loyal to her company, which Wilson will have to update. Well, it's actually this now. So just because they're both company agents does not necessarily mean that they're going to gel. If anything, that will make Clayton more motivated to get back with samples to seem valuable in order to maintain her position, because her job would no longer exist with the company that she works for.
Yeah, it's the difficulty of you've been probably marked as dead for 75 years. Trying to pick that back up is pretty terrifying all of its own. So let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses. We've covered some of them, but what would you like to highlight as a strength? We'll start with those.
One of the biggest strengths, in my opinion, we talked about this a bit, like it leads to some confusing layout for GMs within the book, but I think this scenario should be used as a hallmark for environmental storytelling. There are tons of rooms and hallways along this ship that players can go to at any time, and each of them have really well-placed descriptions that can tell small parts of a really awful history on the Cronus. They can notice that the escape pods are all jettisoned, that the science lab component also has been left behind, that one of the elevators has been firebombed and is at the bottom of the shaft, and several of the rooms have dead bodies that have been torched. And it's just the more that they explore, the worse everything seems. And again, really reinforcing that they're trapped in with all of this.
I agree with that. I complained a little bit about the layout, but you're right. it is absolutely great how they did that. And there are very few kind of rooms in the ship that are just there. There's like maybe one or two where they're like, yeah, this exists, but there's really nothing in it. So, it's not there just to, have space. Um, everything has their own little details, which, overall, like you said, tell the story, but they also combine them really well with the way that the events are. So if you've never looked at the scenario, that there's a section on the ship which you kind of goes through each room, has the maps, and then it has the different events for the three acts. That it's very easy to jump back and forth between the two to see, all right, well, this is where this one is, or this is where this takes place, and so on. Which, at least in my opinion, when you're in like a confined area like this, it's almost like a mini sandbox.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the ship is so huge that,
Right.
yeah, it has to become a sandbox.
Right. Which I found out, when we ran it, leads to interesting things. Well, I'll talk about later.
I want to highlight just two because we're talking about the physical set, the character sheets. I really love they're just double-sided. One side has really kind of the lore side, if you will, of what's this person's background, what's their talent, some of their base stats. So you can still use that side. And then the other side has kind of the number crunchy portion of it where they lay out like, here's their skills, here's their hit points, radiation, like all that stuff is there. But this is basically screaming laminate me and reuse me again and again.
And I think another that's really handy along with those sheets, as I mentioned with all the physical props with this scenario, is handing out cards with the agendas for each of the players that they can keep. As it makes their sheet feel a lot more dynamic. Unfortunately, if you take a replacement NPC, you just get that card, and that's it.
And that's another complaint that I've seen people have, that it doesn't come with character sheets for the NPCs, which are essentially replacement PCs. I'm trying to find it right now. Yeah, the scenario does have those listed out on a couple pages with their stats. And so I think what I did prior to, because I knew I was going to be needing these, is I just went through and I just created those character sheets. And I think, you can find them somewhere, online, to other people who have created character sheets for the NPCs, because you will need to use these.
Absolutely.
If we haven't stressed it enough, the alien role-playing game, especially this scenario, it's deadly. There are so many ways that your PCs are going to die.
Something I really like about the scenario and all of the alien scenarios in general is the agendas, the idea of agendas, the idea that many of them were going to conflict directly with each other. It just gives so much room for role playing, but also pretty organically moves the plot along because they're so well written and so well crafted. But yeah, they just give a lot of really great room for role playing. We can get into more stories, but there's just so many good opportunities for it.
And it's such a helpful thing to just have when you're going, I don't know what I'm going to do in this.
Sure.
And it's a sentence that says, you're a big bad Marine and you're not going to take it anymore, or something like that, where you're like, oh, I know exactly what I do now. It's right here. I'm going to ramp up the gun and shoot everything.
That, and the system does have good mechanics for rewarding that roleplay via story points at the end of each act, which you can use for an automatic success on something if you really, really need something to go off.
The best thing about the story points too are they transfer with the player, not the PC. So if your PC dies, you still keep those story points, which is kind of a nice aspect of the system.
I think the story points are super important, especially as stress just accumulates and it becomes harder and more difficult to achieve a success. But it's also given out so sparingly that it really feels very cinematic when you actually do use it, because it's the moment where like you're staring down death and you just manage to scrape by and escape or something like that. So yeah, I think that's great.
And kind of talking about the agendas too, with all the conflicting agendas, I mean, I completely agree that this gives you a lot of room for role playing. I think that may also be a limitation. And what I mean by that is you really have to have strong role players for some of the characters, some of the PCs.
Yeah.
So Wilson, the Wayland Yutani officer, I really feel that you need to have a strong role player for that, because I feel bad for anybody who plays Wilson, because I think automatically all the other players just don't trust them.
Right.
For good reason, and because we've seen Aliens, and we've seen how Weyland-Yutani acts, and there's a perspective there. But I think you have to have a strong role player for that. I think if you were to like run this at a I'm not gonna say I would be hesitant to run this at like a convention, but I may change up a couple things, because you never know who's going to be at your table then.
Right.
And if you get somebody who it's very easy to take these PCs off the rail.
Yeah.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, because I would never run this at a convention.
And agree specifically that Wilson is probably the most challenging person to role play, except for maybe Lucas too. But it's very challenging, and you have to have the right. I don't know how you do it, but it's like, yeah, maybe so and so should be the company agent. But
and that's something that I don't think we brought up. Lucas, the secret android, they're not a static character. They're randomly chosen from all the PCs. So that adds, I think, a little bit of replayability to this from the GM side, where you never know who Lucas is going to be until you hand out the character sheets. And so I think the scenario does give some recommendations, like don't have Wilson be Lucas, because that kind of conflicts, or I mean maybe you want to just make it a little bit more interesting. But with that kind of randomization of that kind of adds to the scenario as well, because you don't always have this one person over here who's the android. It could be anybody, and then that player will just take that and kind of hook everything together to make it their own, really.
Yeah. I truly loved the secret android component, because whenever I watched you run on Into the Darkness, my jaw was on the floor. I was like, God damn it, I should have known that was a thing. And like, it was a great reveal, even for me, just as a viewer, but I can't imagine even just as players.
And I think a strength I want to hit too, kind of as we're talking about, right, the secret android, that's classic Alien, is there a lot of these tropes are going to match the first Alien movie. They go with that, but they differ it enough. So one of the things that they have is the original Alien has the xenomorphs. These are called neomorphs, and they have roughly the same life cycle, sort of growing and bursting out. But they age super quickly, and then just, I think they say 24 hours is the max limit, and then they just kind of spore out. So they're different, but they're close enough that it's still alien, right? But when the person sees this alien clawing itself out of someone's head as it's basically lobotomized them, that's a different kind of horror that your players probably aren't expecting.
I actually think, like, touching on that, and if we can just transition to limitations, because this is something I have thought off and on for a long time. Like, I very much enjoyed Tyler's run of the game. I thought it was incredible. But sometimes I think about it and I'm like, is this a little too similar structurally, story-wise, major beats? Is it too similar to the Alien movie? What do you guys think?
I don't think so. I think that it is similar enough to give any player and GMs material to draw on to help improvise and entrench themselves more into this narrative and visualization, but gives enough aspects that are different from the existing Alien movies that they don't exactly know what's going to happen next. One of the critiques that I have heard specifically for this scenario in the starter set are grumbles that, oh, I can't believe this uses the black goo from Prometheus. There's not even an actual xenomorph and facehugger on here. And it's like, well, okay, not that that point is not valid, but that is exactly what players are expecting. So like, if that were to have happened, Holly, I would say you're absolutely right. But the fact that they are, in my opinion, freely knocked it out of the park with the Alien RPG, because they have expanded so much on the lore that the movies were able to provide, and expressing how this black goo is a mutagen, creating these similarities between like cancer and birth and reproduction and whatnot. So there's a lot of new elements that players are not likely to be familiar with that can still have similar chest bursty, or in this case, head bursty types of creatures, that it's just different enough that they don't know what to expect. In the same way that like Call of Cthulhu is sometimes criticized that there's no Cthulhu in it. I'm guilty of this too, that like you don't have to have the titular creature in everything. And in fact, whenever it does show up, that can be when it is a big, okay, now it's on moment.
That's fair.
I guess I have mixed. I kind of come in the middle of this. So I really like that it's very similar to Alien, but there are enough aspects lifted up out of it that it kind of subverts your expectations. I will admit, the first time I heard about this scenario, I was like, oh, they're just redoing Alien, and you're going to get in there, you're going to know exactly what happens. But
Same.
really, it's only the part of the first act where it's very similar to it. I mean, yeah, the rest of it is essentially survival horror, but and there are a lot of, I guess there are, as I think about it, there are more things that are very similar to Alien, but I think that kind of lends itself to its strengths because then the PCs or more importantly the players, they're familiar with this enough if they're familiar with the Alien movies that they're kind of living out Alien in its own in their own version. I'll also say that I think a strength of this scenario is you can lift out the neomorphs and the bloodbursters and all of that and replace it with facehuggers and xenomorphs if you want. I think there's very little effort to do that. I mean, with Alien Romulus coming out, I'm sure people are going to take Chariot of the Gods and turn it into what I think Romulus is going to be based on the trailers. So I think it's very easy to lift out if you wanted to.
Yeah, one of the screenwriting ideas is the promise of the premise is if you are sold a survival horror game, it should be a survival horror game, not, a cozy cabin mystery. So when we say you're playing an Alien game, at least for the first one, it should be like Alien. I don't know that I would want to do this again. Kind of to Holly's point of, is it too similar to Alien? Maybe I could do it once, but then let's mix it up. And I think the campaign, I've played Destroyer of Worlds, that's fairly different.
Yeah.
And I
agree with
think
that.
that's great. I wouldn't want another creepy spaceship haunted mystery sort of feel to it.
That's fair. And I think there's value in, this was the first scenario that they ever created, and like you want to, kind of come out strong and make those connections and make that statement. And I think to be clear, I think it's a fabulous scenario. But yeah, it was just something I was like, there's a lot of similar elements, but I ultimately I do agree. There's enough differences that works well, I think.
Just to kind of talk through that, again, from kind of the GM's perspective, like we said, there is a high likelihood of death happening in this scenario. And you've got that initial replacement of NPCs. But I think this kind of goes back to kind of talking about pacing a little bit. If you chew through those too quickly, then what are you going to do? I mean, you do have the Sotilo, which you could bring in, the pirate ship, which again, are you going to do that? But if you don't pace it out correctly, you could very easily, have somebody just kind of sitting there because you've run out of NPC replacements. And then you have to start getting a little bit creative. I mean, I would hate to do something like, oh, well, there just happens to be another one that just woke up out of a hibernation sleep. I mean, you could always do that, I guess, but that would be, I think, a little kind of iffy. There is also there is an android NPC on the Cronus that's damaged, but it can be repaired, and they can act as a PC as well. And that would bring in an interesting thing. They're known to be an android. They're not a secret android. So.
On that note of the replacement NPCs, this was one critique that I did have of the scenario. As you're reading through the events, we've specified there's mandatory and optional ones. One of the optional, air quotes, events is called the infection spreads, which I really disliked. It mentions turning more and more players into antagonists, possibly until only a single unturned PC remains. Which that sounds cool from like a novel or a story perspective. That is not good for a gaming perspective, because that's going to mean there are several people that are just sitting around on their phones while you're just focusing on one player. And I think that you will need to personally adjust pacing on which of the NPCs are going to turn rabid in order to, as Tyler mentioned, not chew through them super quickly. As written, it sounds like they all just become 28 days later whenever it's convenient at the end of Act 2. But that will mean that you may run out of people for your players to beat. There's an idea that I have for this that I want to touch into more in reanimation. But I do think that in addition to a liability of chewing through player character options too quickly, there are not any kind of additional motivations to state for these replacement PCs. It is super likely you're going to burn through your PCs pretty quickly within Act 2, and then everyone else is just survive, and that's it. So I think that it will call on the GM to create some new motivations for them, which again, we can touch on later, but that is a big limitation that I noticed in this.
Yeah, it was very surprising to me that the company rep it starts as an NPC, like even she doesn't get any interesting conflicting agendas. I was like, what?
So, Tyler, when you run this, what's the time frame for Act 1, Act 2, Act 3? What's that kind of look like pie chart wise?
So so in terms of like total time, I think the way that I ran it is not I didn't want to get through like Act 1 as quickly as possible, but there's only so many, things to do in Act 1. If I was playing this out in sessions, I would say Act 1 is probably 1 or 2 sessions. Act 2 and 3 tend to take up then the majority of the time, where I think the majority of everything is in Act 2, because at that point, Act 1 is getting them onto the Cronus, having them discover and get onto the Cronus, and have the reasons for them going over there. Act 2 is exploration and figuring out what's going on, and Act 3 is essentially how do we get out of here? How do we survive? The majority, I think, kind of happens in Act 2. And I think that's where a lot of the interesting pieces happen, because again, it kind of follows that typical kind of like story bell curve where you've got, things ramping up in Act 1 and Act 2. It doesn't really climax in Act 2, but that transition from Act 2 to Act 3 is really where, the PCs realize what's going on and what they have to do. And now it becomes not a struggle, but a priority to get off there. And that's actually where I have one of my issues with the scenario, is that things in Act 2 and Act 3, when like the neomorphs and the abominations start, attacking, coming out, and people start getting transformed, that's over a limited amount of time. But yet some of these tasks take like an entire shift, which I think is like 8 hours or more. If they succeed. If they fail, then it's another shift.
Yeah.
And that can add tension to it, but it can all. I mean, if you ran it like rules as written, I guess that would, I think, kind of, I don't want to say slow the scenario down, but it would certainly mess up pacing.
Yeah.
It might make it better, because then now the PCs have to figure out another way to do this, and you can reward them being creative, or then you fall into the officers agendas, because who is it? Clayton. She's got a escape pod that that's what she uses as a bargaining chip in Act 3. That, hey, we can get off if you want to go with me. But again, I think that can mess up the pacing a little bit.
I think this scenario would have really benefited from having an approximate timeline on these same lines, because I feel that there is a bit of a disconnect between the pacing that is described to repair the Cronus and get things going, and how it's described with the 26 Draconis strain inoculation, and then reading everything in events. Because as they have all of the events clustered together, it just sounds like bang, 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 bang. And that will fall apart in execution. Whereas it mentions with this inoculation that, yes, you were right, Tyler, that it works 95% of the time, but it will inevitably slowly transform someone into one of these abominations. And I think that you really want to emphasize the slowly part in that. And I would not have any of the NPC crew members turn aggressive until Act 3. Because by that point, they're going to spend a lot of time in Act 2 needing to repair the ship and knowing that there are these other things wandering around. So then the crew members turning will be a new surprise that they will need to deal with. And that way, you won't have Clayton immediately try to run to her escape pod. Also, by having this longer stretch of time available in Act 2, that gives Clayton more time to be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to do some stuff. I'm going to repair some things. And she's trying to get the urns out of the med lab and everything else. Because I imagine she's just going to be trying to load up her escape pod and get out of Dodge. She doesn't really have any motivations to stay.
And with that kind of going back to, with the infection, I completely agree with you that kind of save those turnings to Act 3 unless, there's a good reason not to. But I would also say make sure that you're communicating with that player that something's going on. If I remember right, there are cards that you give them that that they're starting to get infected. They're feeling weird, they're feeling sick, and so on. But that also builds up that paranoia of what's going on. Why am I feeling this way? Make sure that paranoia is going on, and if the player isn't kind of acting that out, the GM can absolutely kind of throw that to the other players that, hey, they look a little weird. They look a little pale.
Yeah.
Especially if you have Cooper, the surviving doctor, or is it? I don't remember. They don't really matter. But if you have the one surviving doctor say the inoculation is mostly effective, then like that will just immediately make your players paranoid as hell.
And also, he's the one that explodes, if I recall.
Yeah. Is it Cooper or
It
Flynn that explodes? It's
Cooper explodes.
Okay, Flynn is the surviving one.
Because he won't take the inoculation.
Right.
Because he knew it wasn't fully effective and he feared it would cause the transformations later. So good job, champ.
What a great rock in a hard place that you kind of end up with the players of, okay, do you want to transform yourself and die that way? Or do you want to explode and die that way? There's not a real good answer.
Yeah, it's truly a die sooner or later trade-off. And I think that is I think that this is an excellent starter scenario for the alien system because, like, to Holly's concerns, that players will be assuming that, oh, okay, it's like the alien movies. Got it. Oh, not all of the alien movies are very survival horror. Like, the first one is a hallmark of it, then Aliens is an action movie. And then after that, it's kind of a mix between action with horror elements. And in my opinion, the Alien RPG is an awesome example of this bleak space horror. You don't have to have any xenomorphs in it, and it still works really well as this corporate dystopia space horror that can run right alongside Mothership. You can just tie the two together perfectly fine. So being able to show that this is really a no-win situation and y'all are fucked. But keep playing, please.
All right, before we get into reanimation, I have one more quibble, and this is the very important one. They don't show the final stage art for either the neomorphs or these transformed, they call them like beluga head people, because they kind of transform as they've got this rage. They have the juvenile versions and then like the second to last stage for the person. I want to see the monster. Show me the cool monster.
I feel like, again, not to spoil another scenario, but the abominations do appear also in Destroyer of Worlds. I feel like in Destroyer of Worlds they may show them in there, but I agree, because when I was going through that, these are basically the abominations are basically taken from Prometheus.
Yep.
And so I actually had to go and kind of rewatch those scenes, and it actually took me a little bit to figure out, oh, these are what the couple people turn into in Prometheus. Just to kind of get an idea of really what they were talking about. And the same thing with the neomorphs. Neomorphs are from Covenant, and I honestly didn't remember that, probably because that was not one of my favorite movies of the series. But again, I had to kind of go back and look at that and kind of do a little bit of research into what are the differences between the neomorphs and the xenomorphs and all of that. So call that a strength or a weakness with the scenario. In that it's kind of throwing the aliens at the PCs that they're not expecting, but from the GM perspective, you also now need to get familiar with what those things are.
Yeah. So before we get into reanimating the scenario, which we've already covered a little bit, let's contextualize our general experience. This scenario I've actually read, but I haven't played through.
I played in Tyler's excellent run of it for Into the Darkness, and I've read it, but I've not run it.
I have watched Tyler's excellent run of it for Into the Darkness, and I'm currently prepping to run it for Alex and some others. That's why we have him chained in the basement, and he couldn't attend this dissection.
When I get out of here, HR is going to really hear about this, Lex.
You might hear him underneath the floorboards once in a while.
And obviously, I have run it. I have listened to just a ton of APs for it, just to get familiar with how others ran it, and I mean, in terms of the scenario itself, if I haven't said it before, I really do like this. I think this is a great intro scenario to Alien, to the system. It's a great kind of survival horror, sci-fi horror scenario.
Have you only run it once, Tyler?
Yeah, I've only run it once so
Okay.
far. The reason I've only run it once, and I do want to run it again, is that this is one of those scenarios that I can't imagine how people run this at like conventions in like a 4 hour time frame. Like the scenario even says it takes at least 4 to 5 hours. I have yet to see anybody run it in less than like 8 to 12 hours.
I was
Um,
gonna say, you were mentioning like if I were to run into the convention, I was like, how? That
yeah,
it really feels like running viral in one session. That like you would have to
yeah.
lose so much buildup that I would not try to run this as a convention.
Yeah, I agree. But I would like to run it again because it is really good. And you learn from, just like with any scenario, you learn from when you run it. And there are some things that I would do differently. There's other things that I would pull into it. So it's a great scenario. So because of that, I would, yeah, like I said, I would love to run it again.
All right. Well, let's get into talking about some of that in our reanimation section. So let's talk about how we would highlight the beating heart of the scenario.
For me, and I think this is more representative of the way that I tend to run scenarios. I love that slow, creepy dread buildup. And it sounds like I'm going to be emphasizing this quiet exploration of a dead ship a lot more in Act 1 and the beginnings of Act 2 before I'll have Mother pop on the lights. I think you can make a great kind of jump scare that they've been in this dead ship for so long, and now all of a sudden the lights come on. But in the meantime, I would really want to hammer in all of those environmental details in the beginning to set an atmosphere and mood for the Cronus. Emphasizing all of the darkness, there's all these hazy, low orange lights casting deep shadows everywhere, and playing off of sounds that you hear echoing down these oddly hexagonal hallways because it's Alien.
Yeah, I think the pacing of it all is really going to be very important. And I think we've talked about it a bit, but like Tyler, if you have any other thoughts on how to properly pace this, how not to let it like start snowballing too fast, especially in the beginning, like do you start with some of the environmental clues before they even realize something's gone wrong? Or do you just kind of keep it as this oblique, cold ship and you have no clue what happened here?
Yeah, I think it really does come down to pacing, and it's kind of like really any really good monster movie or monster story. You don't show the monster in Act 1. In fact, I think the technically that you don't actually see the monster in this one or the neomorph exploding out of the doctor until technically Act 2.
Mhm.
But showing those hints of like you were talking about Lexi, showing those hints of what happened, that there are rooms that are burned out or that have been exploded by, chemicals. The weapons locker is empty except for like one gun. You go on to the command center, the front of the ship, and somebody has taken an axe and put it through one of the consoles, and there's no explanation for why. There's all these like little things that just kind of add to the whole atmosphere. And it really all depends on where the players go and what they're doing on how you can stretch that out, especially in Act 1. And when I say stretch out, I don't mean make it, overly long. You still have to, play off the table and see what your players want to do. But the scenario gives you enough of these that you can just start throwing them in. I mean, you can even just lift them out of one room and put them in another if they're like not going to one room and you want them to see something, put it in a hallway and, that's still gonna kind of add to that atmosphere and help with the pacing.
And I think on that note too, it's difficult how some of the wandering elements are indicated nowhere on the maps, that there's a lot to keep track of as a GM with the maps and what's in what room. So you will want to have your own like little tokens to move along. But on that note, I really enjoyed Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. It's basically Ghost Ship meets Event Horizon in space. Anyway, I think that there's a great moment you can bring in with Ava, this wandering android that is very rarely mentioned. But in the players exploring this dark ship, they turn their flashlights over a hallway and see a pale woman walking past a doorway. and they can't tell if they actually saw that or if it was just their imagination, and if this thing is haunted, just to completely pull something out of left field before you bring in more traditional alien elements.
Yeah, and I know that Act One also has a lot of the optional, like they come across the egg sacs, they come across dead bodies that are clearly inhuman in some way. So, like, I think
Yeah.
I would be worried about kind of like showing those cards a little too soon. Like, I like that, like Lex talks about like this haunted, empty ship, and Tyler's point of what the hell happened here. So I'd be worried about tipping the hand of like otherworldly a little too soon. The egg sacs, the inhuman bodies, you know what I mean?
Honestly, I think that egg sacs may be overselling them a little bit,
Okay.
because the way that they're described and the way that they show up in Covenant and everything, it kind of just looks like mold with some, what am I trying to say? Barnacles
Okay.
is what it really reminds me of more than anything. So like they may see that there's some kind of a growth in the shower drains, and everything is frozen over kind of on the ship. So it's just going to look like this thing is super old, and that there's these kind of weird moldy growths all over the place, but it's not immediately alien giant egg sitting in the middle of a room somewhere.
Makes sense.
I like the urns too that you can find on the Cronus, is having that kind of hint of the old engineer civilization is an important kind of tie-in to have that can put a lot of this together of like, why did this happen? Oh, these dummies brought one of these urns that can transform people. Like, that's an important player moment to kind of piece together the story.
I will admit, I don't want to say it's an issue with the egg sacs or whatever we want to call them. I think the scenario wants you to put them in more places than they should be, especially in the beginning. You know, you kind of want them to have an air of danger to them, or at least uncertainty in the beginning. But there are certain rooms which are just like covered in them. And once the PCs realize, or the players realize that, oh, there's a chance that if we breathe in these things, or somehow they're dangerous to us, that can change the scenario, and it can kind of remove that factor. But I think that's part of where with your spacesuits, they're only, you only have air for so long. Alien has a mechanism where you're supposed to be rolling every turn for, your air to see if you're losing air, you're running out of oxygen. And there are replacement suits in the ship, but they're limited in how many there are. So I guess, in one way that can kind of play up to the paranoia and who's infected and so on. But that's something that I would introduce slowly at first, and then later on, because at some point it's just going to become, I think, played out if you do it too quickly. Okay, all right, there's another one of those, but we're wearing our suit, we're okay, and so on.
And I think that maybe some of that could be accomplished by just thinking on, in the beginning, this thing is at space temperatures. So that's where I think it makes sense that most of the abominations are in a hibernation state. And I think that these spores would be pretty much inactive. They can step on them and crunch them and nothing's going to happen. But as it warms back up, they will act a little differently. Because at that point, presumably, the NPCs will be aware and say, oh, that's bad. And then you would need to somehow deal with that.
Yeah. Do you have trouble, Tyler, with the people not taking off their spacesuits? Because I see this in a lot of the Alien games that I listen to, is the players are pretty savvy to these things and they go, no, I'm keeping my suit on all the time. I don't want to breathe the air. I don't want to touch the thing.
Yeah, I didn't have that issue when we were running it, but that could definitely become an issue, and that's where those roles come into play. My only concern with those roles for air is that if you're doing it every turn, I think a turn is technically like 5 or 10 minutes in game. You're constantly doing that, and then at some point it becomes, all right, go ahead and roll again. You kind of lose that the paranoia aspect of it.
I think that could be something that you can resolve as GM secret roles, honestly.
Oh,
because as a player, I love rolling for battery life on flashlights and the motion detectors, because I am deciding when to use that. But if the GM is rolling for oxygen, and then I can just say like 50% oxygen, the players can be like, oh, wait, fuck, what? And then checking their meters to realize they're burning through it quicker than they anticipated. And it also allows you to give some more narrative control.
That's a great idea, actually. I never thought about that. Yeah. That's one of the things I think with Alien is it tries to push as many roles onto the players for good reason. But I agree with that. That is I think one place where it would be good to have those secret roles. Another thing that you can do, and I think I did this during the game too, is the spacesuits, they're not impenetrable.
Yeah.
They're you get into fights, you're in a dangerous environment, those can rip. And that would be another good thing to have, does the PC notice or do they get warning that there's a rip in their suit?
Especially if they're keeping the suits on after they've restored the environment in the Cronus, because
Right.
then there's
Right.
not going to be a giant hissing air escaping because it's the same atmosphere.
But yeah, to the point of like oxygen depletion, like even if your players are super insistent, like I will always wear this suit forever, I will die in this suit.
Yes, you will.
It's sure, yeah, you will. You're talking about like full shifts of work, especially in Act 2. Like simply the oxygen will not last that long.
Right.
At some point, they must remove their helmets and breathe in the air of the ship. It's unavoidable.
And you can also make their tasks more difficult because they're going to
Yeah.
be fumbling around with these really thick gloves.
And they're going to be slower too when they're running away from the things that are attacking them.
Yeah.
Running away in a bulky suit. And if I remember, I would need to go back and look, but the suits from the Montero I think are a bit more nimble, but the ones from the Cronus, they're kind of the old school, almost like what we have as spacesuits now. And so they're not gonna be, you're not dexterous in those. You're kind of like this lumbering Michelin man walking down the hallway. That's really gonna, affect how you do things.
Oh man, this just gave me an excellent idea. So I was saving this point to bring up later, but after the ship gets the temperatures restored, one of my little critiques with the scenario is I feel like it relies too much on the abominations being, oh, it's a huddled spacesuit. And it's like after the second or third one, like, okay, I shoot it because it relies too much on the, oh, it's just a spacesuit. Gotcha. And I think that after the station wakes up a bit, at least the one abomination that's in the reactor control communication room, I think that they should get warm and wake up and start patrolling the ship. And oh my God, if you have players that are insisting on wearing their spacesuits, they can't easily be told apart from the abominations wandering around too. And they can't run away from them as fast.
That's a great idea. I think I did read through this over the last couple of days just to refresh my mind, but I think the abomination in the reactor room, that is the only one that's really still alive at the start of the scenario. There's one in the med lab, but it only wakes up as like a jump scare.
There's that one that's mentioned as an optional event, and I really thought there was
on the outside of the ship.
No, there's one on the outside. There is one that is an Act 1 optional event that killed a certain player very quickly in a certain run. I really thought that there was another one. Hang on, scrolling again. You'll be doing that a lot when you run this scenario.
I just want to note too the outside of the ship one. I know that's a little bit getting into Act 3 of as they might escape, but just the idea that for 75 years there's just been this thing holding on to this spaceship. Like, I'm not letting go. I don't care how long this takes. I'm gonna get somebody.
Yeah, and that kind of gets into, like you said, in Act 3, there are certain things that they have to do in order to escape. They have to restore power, and they have to restore the communications array. I think there may be one other thing. But in order to restore power and restore the communications array, they have to go outside the ship. They have to do a spacewalk, which can add its own things to it.
Yeah, that was something I really liked about the scenario, is that not only that, there are, I think, 2 or 3 different reasons for them to do a spacewalk outside. That they are going to have to spend a lot of time on the Cronus, and they're going to have to go in and out through the airlocks a few times, which can lead a lot of additional ways to shake things up, especially because the Cronus has been through a small asteroid field once. And you can have a micro asteroid field hit it again while they're out on a spacewalk if you really want to spice things up.
And this is where like the Daisy from the Montero comes into play if they saved it, because then they can use that to do it. But you're right with the airlocks. I think one of them is automatically damaged, and the one that you enter the Cronus into, there's an event where that doesn't shut all the way. So as you're entering in, when we played it, that airlock was permanently shut or something like that. It it was welded shut. And so, if you need to go out, great. Now, how are you going to get out? There's a big bay where you can open things up to go out but are they going to do that? That does play into your kind of encouraging creativity from the players.
Yeah.
I think is something else that you can do to shake this up and really emphasize the beating heart of this scenario as not your dad's alien movie, if I can say that. That makes me hurt. Never mind. Redact that. But that because this is emphasizing these neomorphs and not the xenomorphs that we are very familiar with, it actually mentions in the appendix that bloodbursters can manifest in any part of the body,
including the appendix.
There's no rules that it has to just be in the chest or in the head, as players will soon find out. So there's a lot of room that you can play in for some weird body horror elements, like maybe someone's dragging their foot and saying it's like, oh, I twisted my ankle, don't look at it. Or maybe someone can wonder, was Clayton pregnant? Like lots of weird stuff you can bring up in there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'd be really tempted to have someone just be riddled with these things where it's just like one of them pops out and then the others just start going as well, one after the other. So you have that moment of like, shoot that one. And then they turn back and this like the kneecaps bulging out, their rib cage cracks and you're seeing like 3 or 4 of these start to scuttle into the vents.
I think you want to be careful with that, though, because you don't want to have too many neomorphs on the ship because then it becomes Aliens. It becomes that action horror. And you want to try to, I think if you want to play to the strengths of the scenario, you want to kind of keep it that paranoid, being stalked by these creatures. And so by limiting that I think that helps it. Plus, you have the abominations too, which almost everybody in the crew could turn into. So that kind of adds to it as well. From my perspective, again, as running it, it is a little bit difficult, or at least it was difficult for me to balance those out because you don't want to, I guess in my mind, I don't want to, kind of be throwing antagonists at the PCs just to do it. I don't want it to be, oh, there's another one coming at you. Oh, wait, yeah, you killed that one. Great. Here's 2 more coming at you, something like that. In sort of worlds, that's fine to do because that's what it's kind of meant to be. Whereas here, I think it plays on that strength of, there's something stalking you in the ship. You don't know where it is. You can hear it. In fact, the abominations, you can hear them, kind of screaming out and lumbering through the ship or through the vents and all that. And, because they're not as familiar with the ship, the PCs, may not know how to find them.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually a question I was going to ask you based on your experience is how lethal are the neomorph bloodbursters compared to the juveniles compared to an adult, and then with the abominations? Because I am concerned about chewing through too many player characters too quickly. And I know a certain someone got one shot by an abomination. So yeah, if you had any kind of guesstimations for the scenario, assuming the players are not armed to the teeth, how many neomorphs would you be okay dealing with on the ship? Like a maximum of 2 or?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't do more than like 2 or 3. The scenario already has 2 or 3 on there. So I don't know if I would do many more than that. Maybe add in 1 or 2 more. But yeah, I mean, you are absolutely right. The neomorphs and especially the stage 4 abominations, which is when they're most deadly, just like with anything in Alien, you probably have a 1 in 6 chance of getting killed. There are some things to help prevent that, like your suits do provide a little bit of armor. They still have to hit you and things like that. But just like what we're so is it okay to go into what happened in the Into the Darkness game with Stuart?
Yeah, for Chariot of the Gods, absolutely.
Yeah, so
listeners, stop here and then watch that, then come back.
Yeah, at least go watch the first episode because this I think illustrates just how deadly the alien can be. So when we were playing, Stuart was playing one of the, I think like the mechanic or something like that. And, rightfully so. He's like, I'm going to go to the reactor in the Cronus and get things working up. Well, that is where one of the only abominations is. And it even says in there, if they come in and start repairing things, it wakes up and starts attacking. And so inevitably, it woke up and started attacking Stuart's character. And we ended the episode where the abomination, I rolled where it basically crushed his head, which is an insta kill. So we ended the episode with Stewart's character being, murdered by this abomination. And the last thing that the other players saw, because I think we added in that there were like little cameras that you could see what everybody was doing. The camera, you see the cracks along the glass, and then of his visor, and then nothing. And these creatures can be super deadly, which is again why I think you need to pace it out a little bit in order to not chew through all of the PCs and the NPCs. But I think it also, killing somebody off or killing a couple people off initially, even if they're just some of the NPCs, I think helps show to the players, especially if they've never played Alien before, just how deadly this system is. And so it changes, I think, the aspect of it from, oh, there's the creature, let's go kill it, like you would in Aliens, to there's the creature, let's get the hell out of here and go hide, or, come up with a plan on how we're going to, combat this creature. And then once they kill the first one, then that's when you have the second one come in, or you hear out in the distance of the ship a scream from one of these things.
Speaking from the player perspective of being on the receiving end of like Stewart dying in the very first session at the very end, it was great. It was such a cue that like, we're not fucking around here. Like people are dying. Like I was like, oh my God. I figured, that it would end similarly to Alien, where, most of us, if not all of us, would die, but I was not expecting it 2 hours in.
To be honest with you, I felt bad about that, and I actually reached out to him afterwards, because I actually screwed up the rules at that point. I didn't realize it until a couple of days later, where he was supposed to get an armor roll, which would have prevented him from dying, and so we actually did that off camera, and he still failed.
Of course he did, poor Stewart.
Yeah,
but you're right. It kind of just shows just how we're not screwing around here. And there was actually one of the I do read through the comments of the games on YouTube, and this happened later on in the scenario where everybody was fighting one of these abominations, and it kept doing the same thing, or it wasn't doing what, something to its advantage, I guess, and the reason that is because I kept, I was trying to stick to what the tables for what it would do are, and I was rolling the same thing. And I did fudge the rolls, once or twice just to kind of change things up, but somebody complained about that. But it kind of comes down to, these are essentially mindless beasts at that point. It kind of makes sense to go with the rolls and, just kind of, see where it takes you, because it does, I think, sometimes lead to more interesting results.
Yeah. And I think that on that note with Stewart, this scenario has so many great cliffhangers to end sessions, as well as the acts too, because like I think even if Stewart's thing had not happened, there's a lot of great plot beats to end the different acts on. The book does recommend, I think very well, to end Act 1 by Mother alerting the self-destruct sequence for the Montero. That is a big what the fuck moment that can lead into a next sort of arc for the players. It's a great cliffhanger. Ending the session of Act 2 with like maybe one of the PCs starting to succumb to a rage if they're clearly infected, or having another bloodburster appear or something like that. There's a lot of ways you can really pace this out into some good plot beats.
I also want to mention too, for that self-destruct, it's 10 minutes, which is like the perfect amount of time where you could, in theory, get something done, but you're going to be under a time crunch. Like they mentioned of, what if you try and get some of the supplies off the Montero? What if you try and run up and convince it, no, don't blow up? There's time to do that, but not really enough time to do it safely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it definitely adds into that, oh, we need to do something right away, feeling that the PCs are just kind of, at that point, I think they're kind of grasping at straws, how do we not die, as well as, how do we get these off? And this is another way where you could easily lose a lot of PCs quickly. And even the scenario calls out that, when the Montero is doing that countdown, there's no way to stop it. And one of the things that can be done is one of the PCs sacrifices themselves and, pilots it away. Or that's where Daisy comes in, where, they run and, they set it to autopilot and they run back. And But if it doesn't get far enough away, there's going to be more damage to the Cronus, which could cause explosive decompression in some rooms, which, again, can lead to PCs dying very, very easily depending on where they're at. So I think you have to be careful with that too, because if you don't want to lose many PCs, you may want to extend that time out a little bit as a GM, just to, again, not to let them succeed, but just maybe lower the consequences just a little bit.
I call that transitioning to movie time. That like I'm not keeping accurate track, but
Yeah.
okay, it seems like this is a 1 minute left moment. You're gonna run 2 miles. All right, well, give me a roll and we can see if that can happen.
All right, so let's get into what kind of plot points, NPCs, just general flow would we want to remove, improve, make slight alterations to?
One that I want to bring up as a discussion point, because I think that there is a timetable for how long the NPCs will last until they transform into abominations, and presuming the players are going to inoculate themselves because they're going to get bloodbursty very quickly. How long until everyone turns into these abominations? It's truly inevitable. Everyone on the ship is going to die. What are your thoughts on playing out PvP at the table, especially whenever there are fewer clean player characters available than there are players, to start transitioning things to an us versus them mechanic that some players will now take the role of abominations wandering the ship, and the other players are trying to still survive and navigate, or just get on to Clayton's crew vessel until they can escape. That way everybody can stay engaged at the table. That was my idea, but I'm curious on your thoughts because I know not every table jives with PvP.
I think when you get to the end, especially in Act 3, if you're not going with the Sotilla encounter where you get more PCs, I think you have to do that first off if you run out of PCs, unless you want somebody just kind of sitting around doing nothing, and that's no fun for them. Personally, I don't have an issue with that, as long as it is within reason, because I could see it getting a little crazy too fast. The only thing that I would need to figure out is the abominations have, like I said, the tables that you're supposed to roll for their attacks. Are you going to make the PC use those for their attacks, or do you let them just do whatever they want? I don't know how I do that, honestly. I have mixed feelings either way.
Yeah, that's interesting because that really gives a lot of control over these monsters to the player characters that are doing them. Um, yeah, maybe you could do a bit where their old self shines through, like maybe they're not quite beluga yet or something, and say, like make a wits roll to at this moment come to your senses and do something. And
I think it could definitely be a case to print off some maybe like blood spattered sheets to hand off to those players as the new abomination sheets, because the infected agenda is simple enough, giving way to a growing urge. Kill. Your fellow crew members are no longer your friends, they're your prey. You must kill them with your bare hands. So I would give these new abomination sheets a decent to hit roll, and like they wouldn't roll on the table. They would have enough agency to be like Hulk smash. But they would have very low wits. And if they see someone that they know, there's this moment that the infected can get confused as there's lingering parts of themselves that they may have to roll against wits or be stunned as they're kind of, and I guess they're turning into Tim Allen. But then they can try and kill afterwards to give a little bit more of a fighting chance.
I think that the thing that we've reiterated multiple times already is the pacing, and also what makes the most interesting cinematic moments. If we're leaning into cinematic mode, your PCs, they become infected, and you just slow roll it until the very end when it becomes very interesting that they are rapidly infected now. And it, like when it's just the most thematically and cinematically interesting, and you can just kind of plague them with, are you feeling okay? maybe it's been a long day and you're stressed, and it's like very slow rolling these that slow infection until the very end of Act 3 when it's like, yeah, you're infected. Go for it. I don't know. That's just my thought anyway.
Yeah. No, I think that's good because one of the terrifying things about the neomorph, at least with the initial bloodburster one they have, is the NPC is getting their brain literally transformed. So they're starting to talk nonsense and garble their words. And that's pretty terrifying to see someone just rapidly on set go blah, 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 drool, and then their head bursts open. I think that's pretty strong paranoia if you play up for them that they're like, I'm so, where are we? What are we doing? You can kind of go for that. And then, Holly, to your point, later on, you can start saying, like, oh, you're looking for your laser cutter. Where did you put it? Oh, it's way over there. You don't remember that. Why don't you remember that? Even if they're not actually infected, you can start putting that stress paranoia of them going, is one of these in my head?
That could be a great implication for rolling stress die during the shifts to try and repair the ship. Because like sometimes rolling on a panic table doesn't make a lot of sense if they're taking their time. But if they do roll some ones, you can start using that as indicators to enforce that paranoia that maybe they are just being forgetful, but it's still stressing them out more.
And I just remembered this. I would need to go back and look it up because I can't find it in the rule book really fast. But I don't think this is in the starter set rules. And I know we were just kind of sticking to what was in the starter set rules because they do give you I don't know, it's like 40 or 50 pages of rules of the game. But in the main core book, I think there is a hibernation sickness that can happen, which does cause hallucinations. So because of that, literally everybody in the scenario, all the PCs are waking up from the cryo sleep. And so you could throw in your own optional encounters at the beginning where somebody is, seeing this because of the cryo sleep. And then, later on, that just increases the paranoia. Am I still having these hallucinations because of cryo sleep? Or is this actually happening? I think, Lex, with what you were saying before, with Ava, having that like ghost woman walking down the halls, I think that's a perfect way to introduce that as well. In fact, I think I'm probably going to steal that the next time I run it.
Yeah, that's great.
Hell yeah.
So leaning into the PvP of it all, who does everyone think should be Lucas? Like, which PC character should be Lucas in your mind, Tyler?
That's a great question. I agree with the scenario to stay away from having Wilson be Lucas, to having the Weyland-Yutani officer be Lucas, because at that point, the agendas are kind of contrary to each other. And Wilson is such a great PC with their own agenda to have regardless. I think that helps. I think I would also, if I had to pick, I probably would also not make the captain Lucas. Because the captain could easily subvert what everybody's doing to kind of accomplish their agenda. But then again, that would be kind of interesting as well. So I guess, in the end, Wilson is really the only one that I would stay away from. Having Lucas be anybody else, I think, kind of adds its own unique aspects to the game. And again, it's all going to depend on the player too. If is the player a role player? Are they, a war gamer? Are they going to go towards the combat versus, something else? So it's an interesting unknown element to the game.
Yeah. That is with me. I would give Lucas to my one of my top 2 or 3 role players. Like that would be my deciding factor is who I think could handle that without just okay and then acting like a robot very obviously.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think it would come down to role player, but also agree with not Wilson. I kind of agree actually not the captain either, because to me the captain is like almost a little bit primed to kind of be the final girl, if nothing else, just because they're the one person that's like trying to keep their crew together, take care of people. It's you got the druggy pilot, you've got, the company person who has their own agendas at play. I don't know. I think the captain to me is because you want someone with like this leadership role that, is trying to kind of be this cohesive leader. And then the foil to that is the Lucas character. I don't know, just my opinion.
I think I would like to talk about different motivations for the NPCs if you are going to take the extra step to make the sheets, and at least, everyone they start with one motivation, and I would want to come up with new ones for at least each of them. Clayton, I think, already has them laid out, just not one.
Clayton being the other ship's company.
The other
Yes,
company,
Clayton is
for
the
sure.
other ship's company agent. And through several events, it's clear that they are going to be quietly moving about the ship, trying to gather the other urns and the other scientific samples in order to get back to their corporate suite, open the safe to get money and the data cube. And then, they're probably going to try and jettison the escape pod. One note that also this is all just little bitty dots across this whole scenario. The escape pod is not described in any meaningful detail. The entrance to it is kind of obscured by what looks like a walk-in closet door. But if you look on one of the map pages, it mentions that there are 3 cryopods within the corporate agent's escape pod. And I think that the staff and Clayton would know that the urns need to be kept in deep cold or they will begin sweating. That I think that if she is going to plan to scoot to Earth, then one of those pods is going to be taken up with the urns.
Yeah, that's good.
Then that means that there's 2 more left, one for her. As written, she wants to take Flynn as the other researcher who may know enough, but I think that that would be a good motivation for her, is to find someone she can trust and or manipulate enough to take on and pull aside to say, hey, we can get out of here. Everyone here is dead. We may be infected, but if we can stay in cryo, Wayland or the Yutani Corporation, is it Wayland? Whatever.
Wayland Yutani, yeah.
Yeah, but she works for just Wayland, I think.
Oh,
but
that's
right.
she
Yeah,
can
yeah.
say, Wayland Yutani can cure us. I know that
Yeah.
with this data, they can cure us and we can actually live. So I think that Clayton has the easiest one. But did y'all have any ideas for other motivations for the NPC, soon to be PCs?
I wanted to highlight too is I think the urn needing to be in freezing is a nice timeline for her too, of she has to be a little reckless and start grabbing and going, which explains a little bit why your player characters are going to catch her with the urn in her arm going down the hallway and going, "Oh, hi. Yes, I'm just moving this. Don't worry. Carry on with your repairs."
And that's something that I think, this is more of a tangent, but I like how aliens' social skills are called manipulate, because I think that that's a lot better than persuade for an NPC rolling against a player or players rolling against each other for these communication type roles. Because, no, it is not mind control, but you can say, well, you feel like she's got a really good point, to at least show that they may be feeling a little bit more predisposed to agree. But sorry, that's just a random tangent.
I think you could give good, interesting agendas to, I think it's Flynn is the researcher, because he has this knowledge of what this is and what it's capable of. So I think there's definitely space to give him interesting agendas. The rest of the NPCs were kind of bland to me. There's a Marine, right? I think.
Yeah, there's a Marine, there's the captain, there's the second in command, and then Ava. There's Cooper, who's the main scientist, but he dies within the first 5 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
So in the scenario that there are initial agendas, but it's really more notes for the GM, I think, as opposed to player agendas. Like the officer, he doesn't want to make any decisions. He wants to pawn everything off onto his second in command, and so playing into that adds an interesting aspect to it. I agree with you. The Marine is actually kind of the hardest one that I have to, assign agendas to, because their agenda, it says, terminate all threats to the Cronus crew with extreme prejudice, no matter the risks for you. So they basically become this mindless killing machine, essentially, which it doesn't really, work in this scenario. I mean, it does, because then, you have somebody who actually has a weapon within the scenario, because they come with a shotgun, essentially. But I would, maybe trying to change things up a little bit. I think there's history that you can play with too, that you can build into this, because this is just the surviving crew of the Cronus. Most of the crew was killed off, and so like Lex, you mentioned, is Clayton pregnant? Well, why not have her talk about her boyfriend or her fiance who was killed as part of this? And so that kind of lends a little bit more credence to that and, gets people thinking along those lines.
I like the idea of making the Marine a deeply paranoid individual. I mean, because she would be, right?
Yeah.
Like
Mm-hmm.
all this PTSD and this deeply paranoid, like you can't trust anybody. And like who can you trust? Is everyone infected? I maybe that's not necessarily an agenda, but at least like a point of giving this really deadly person this deep paranoia of who can I trust? Can I trust anyone? I don't think I can trust anybody, and I need to get out of here.
On similar lines with that, and based on what you just said, Tyler, I am really imagining the Colonial Marine, Reed is the name that we're given for this.
That's right. Yeah.
She can become kind of the Dr. Blair from The Thing. And I think that her motivation is to terminate all threats to the Cronus crew. She's already paranoid. I would have her like she had to kill her partner on the ship. Like maybe they were the ones that were in the elevator and wakes up already clutching this shotgun. When she starts to realize that the crew themselves are compromised and other people are starting to turn in these things, she is probably the one that lodged the axe in the command console that like this cannot get back to Earth. So as people start transforming and she realizes all of them are infected, no one gets out.
Yeah.
And so she can become very paranoid. And this is getting into, you can tell I'm more okay with PvP at my tables, but she can be more of a crusader antagonist towards the end of it. And then if a player becomes that, then maybe they believe that they are not infected and they have to get out, but make sure no one else does to give a major conflicting motivation there.
Good.
Which is funny because they're basically infected at that point.
Yes.
My only motivation is kill.
I think that's a requisite for Colonial Marines.
It would make for an interesting, if you only have like one person left or nobody left, an interesting epilogue is the Cronus arriving at Earth.
Yeah, I love that. Like, I think that that's a great way to have the epilogue, and it's, it lands at the Weyland-Yutani station. They have to cut open the door, and then you hear this moving around inside. If you felt so inclined, you could even make a map and give your players a little catharsis to play as the Abominations and just rip up that first area of a Yutani.
I like that. That's a great idea, actually. Especially, when you're playing this scenario and, again, you're not, this isn't a one shot. Well, I mean, this is, a one shot, but it's not a, short scenario. Kind of, like you said, letting your players just kind of act out the end of that for these unknowing Weyland-Yutani analysts who are coming in to, figure out what happened.
Just another day on the job. Got my lunch pail. Gonna cut open the door and oh no.
Well, and I think that that can be one too, that maybe you can then show that Yutani just nukes that one landing pad, that like they just jettison the entire thing, and that all of this was for nothing, but these are the steps that the corporation will go to try and claim, and if it can't, it'll destroy anything and everything.
I don't know why I just thought about this, but I mean, if you wanted to create this as being something, longer than just, Chariot of the Gods, I am firmly of the belief that have you all ever seen the Sean Connery movie Outland?
No.
Where you have to see it. I love that movie.
Is that the red bikini one?
No, that would be Zardos. That's a whole other realm of cosmic lore. No, so the premise is he is a sheriff on a space station, on a mining space station. And there are so many things within that movie which could easily put it into the alien universe. You could easily, just have the instead of it docking on Earth, having the Cronus dock on Earth, having it dock onto a space station. And now your players are the players from the space station, or they're the sheriff on the station, or the scientist, and they're trying to figure out what happened. And of course, it's going to, spread within the space station itself, kind of almost like an alien isolation type scenario.
That could be great. Like so much of the scenario, I think why I like it so much is it reminds me of Dead Space. And then taking that into a second part would be like a Dead City almost.
Yeah.
Well, now let's get into story time here. I think we've had some interesting experiences. So let's hear some stories and advice that comes out of this.
I can tell two different stories of the company man and how it went well and how it went terribly. So I'll start with my friend who played this very recently after it got released at a convention in a 4-hour time block. And he was the company man. And the person who was the captain, it was just a classic situation of metagaming and like, I know where this is going and I'm going to try to stop it from happening. And so I know.
Tell me you play D&D without telling me.
So the captain like zoned in on my friend very early and was like, we're not listening to a damn thing you say because you're the company man and you don't have any of our interests at heart. Like basically just short of saying, I think you're a traitor or a robot or whatever. So it became this power struggle, and not in a fun way of like, my friend would suggest something and then he'd be like, no, we're not listening to anything you say. And it's like, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to sit here for like anything he suggested, the captain would immediately like refuse. And I think some of that at some point has to be on the game master of like, look, this isn't, because this is the person who literally holds your salary in their hands. You cannot just tell them, fuck you, I'm not doing anything you say. This is your boss. This is the person representing the company. But anyway, so perfect example of the company man has to go to the right person, because my friend is not that strong of a personality. Like if someone's going to be that aggressive at him, he's going to be like, fine, man, whatever. I'm not like, that's not what I'm going to do.
Yep.
So not a great situation. On the inverse, and funny enough, these people have the exact same name. My friend's name is David. And then I played Alien with David Gassaway, who did such an incredible job as the company man and just perfectly embodied him. And at some point, he gets into this argument with the other company rep from the Cronus, and he laid it out. And he was like, we own you. I don't think you understand what situation you are in right now. You are a part of a company that doesn't exist anymore. You are dead by our records. You are, we own you, basically. So it was an incredible amount of role playing from David, but it just really highlights that the company man has to go to the right person. Otherwise, it just all kind of falls apart, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that I'm not going to say that they have a pivotal role within the scenario, but they kind of do, because they're both on the player side, but they're also an antagonist to the players and the NPCs. Your point, Holly, that it's not really just the person playing the company man. It's also everybody else, because you don't want to get into that situation like you described. Everybody is just automatically against them and they're not going to, listen to them, because, if you have everybody else overpower that player, then that player kind of gets left out. When we played it in Into the Darkness, it went really well. There was that conflict, there was that animosity towards the company officer, but it didn't really affect the game negatively because, to be fair, everybody who was playing were amazing players. And so everybody knew how to, still play within the role playing, but also not derail the story, because that's what my character would do.
Well, and it's like the company man, and I think maybe you could even like emphasize this. The company man has a lot of power. Like the power dynamic between the company man and everyone else is that they have power over these people. So it's like, yeah, you're not going to like them. Tough shit. Like they are your boss.
Yeah, the captain just steers the boat.
Yeah.
The company man is the boss. I think that's a really great point.
But also, I think using that, I don't think it's called bonds, but like whatever the rival and the buddy system, and like making sure that they have a buddy, and then like encouraging that like your buddy is your buddy and you're going to stick up for this person. And
I've got bad news. Wilson has no buddy.
Oh no.
Ain't got nobody.
All they have is the rival, which is the captain.
Yeah.
But I agree, is you could easily add in that they've made a friend of one of the workers or something. Yeah. That might be a fun dynamic.
Or, I mean, it could be great that they start with nobody, and there's your extra motivation for Flynn, the medic on the Cronus. They always seemed a little bit weaselly, so they may latch on to the new company man. They're like, okay, I got to live. I got to get out of here. How are we going to do it? And so, boom, there you have an extra motivation for them.
Finally, a friend.
I did have a question for you, Tyler. I think it's been a couple of years since we played Chariot of the Gods, but if I remember correctly, David, as the company man, sets the whole thing to self-destruct. Is that the agenda of the company man, or am I misremembering what happened there?
No, I thought it was Lucas who
Okay,
set things
that
to
might have been what it is
self-destruct.
then. Okay.
And if I remember right, because we did actually play out one of these scenes at the end after everybody, spoiler alert, died. Um, I think Lucas, I can't remember if they set it to self-destruct or they just set it for the um, something else to happen. Because I know the ship did survive.
Oh.
But no, the agenda for the company man is really to, if I remember right, it's basically just to do what's necessary to get the Draconis strain back to Weyland-Yutani.
Yeah.
That with what Lex was really reading earlier, that order from Mother is meant for them, and so that kind of points them towards getting the Draconis strain, getting the Cronus back to Weyland-Yutani so that they can recover all the artifacts. And the crew is secondary or tertiary or don't even matter. If everybody dies, so be it, as long as the ship gets back.
Yeah, Tyler, you're absolutely right. In that time I was browsing through the different motivation cards, and with Lucas, they are not instructed to blow up the ship. And even in the note to Lucas in the special order that Wilson gets, it does not mention that. I chalk this up to another case of a corporation has multiple orders, and only those that need to know are given the relevant details. So the ship also blows up as part of this order 966, but the company man doesn't need to know that.
Oh wait, so I'm sorry. Were you talking, Holly? Were you talking about the Cronus blowing
I was
up or
talking
the
about the
Montero
Cronus.
blowing
At
up?
some point, like we are
Oh.
all killed at the end by some catalyst. It's not just the alien, but I couldn't. I'm sorry, we're not really getting into anything interesting now in this discussion. But like, was it like a
Yeah, I'm gonna have
rapid
to go back and look.
decompression? There was some event.
I think so.
Okay.
I think that's what it was. I think there was an explosion or something like that, and then all the oxygen was
That's
vented out,
probably
and then
okay.
and
Yeah,
that,
it was probably the
we just kind
oxygen.
of walked through that. Everybody, eventually your oxygen ran out if you survived, or
That
the
yeah.
neomorphs or the abominations
That does
got
sound
you.
accurate. Yeah. I knew it was some catalyst ensured basically a TPK, but I didn't think it was an explosion, and I couldn't figure out who'd caused it because I think that's not.
I do remember it was Lucas. It definitely was Lucas. Right.
And that's a question for folks. We play a lot with people that are 100% okay and used to, oh, we're going to die. Everyone's going to die in this scenario. How would you prep people for that? That maybe, like you said, D&D, a lot of people, when they play D&D, don't die. It's kind of tough, a lot of the games.
You give them the 10 candles talk at the beginning. Like, you're probably all going to die. Just lean into
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I think that this is a case of, this game may not be right for everyone's table
Yeah.
for that exact reason. And if you are at all concerned about that, or if your group does not play horror games generally, it will definitely be worth a conversation from the outset saying, hey, this is a survival horror scenario. There will be a lot of death in it. There is a significant chance your characters will die and need to move on to other ones. There's also a high chance of PvP. Is everyone okay with this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if your players are like that, then it would be better to start with one of the Colonial Marine scenarios.
Yeah.
Because there was that at that point becomes more action horror.
Yeah.
And there's a higher likelihood you're going to survive because you have all the tools, you have all the guns, you have all the armor.
I don't know. It
You
didn't help me.
you may even have tanks and stuff like that.
That's a
So
great point. And also, there's a lot of teamwork involved in the Colonial Marines one. It's a little bit less
right.
conflicting agenda. There's some, but yeah, a little bit less.
Yeah.
I do like that and maybe this is something you could bring up with the players, is that at least the first two, with Chariot of the Gods, Destroyer of Worlds, and then Heart of Darkness, you're not gonna have the same characters. Like, not a big spoiler there is, even if you survived, it's gonna be different. And I think making that explicit might help people go, oh, okay, I don't have to carefully try and, guide this character through so that they survive. If they die, and I'm still equal footing with everybody else next scenario.
I think with phrasing with that, I would say that these are standalone scenarios.
There you go. Yeah.
Not trying to say, like, from the outside, if you say no one's going to live, I'm like, oh, Okay. But yeah, if you just say that like they're part of a series, but they are separate books. They're standalone scenarios in the same universe that may have tie-ins. That's all that you really need to get into there, in my opinion.
I like it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like I said, with what we did with Destroyer of Worlds, the second in the trilogy, we did tie it together.
Mhm.
It's very loosely tied together. But you can do that, especially if you're playing with the same people. You can have callbacks to your previous games, which I think is kind of a strength of this trilogy. You're right. They are kind of like, one shots within the same universe or within your same, created universe, but having those tiebacks, if you're playing through all three, will, absolutely kind of, make it more memorable for everybody.
Okay, so let's talk about expansion. We just said it's pretty standalone. It's literally the start of the Draconis Strain saga. But what other sort of things do you guys want to add or change?
I think we kind of got into this with the fully infected ship lands at maybe Anchor Point or some other station for Wayland Yutani. And then that's when the infected spill out. You now have Dead City.
I do like the idea of having the infected, like an almost infected, maybe a one shot that would be like a 2 hour of you just let the players loose and be like, yeah, take as many people out as you can in this time and just have fun rip roaring through this lab and racking up a kill count of I got 20 scientists, a dock worker, and the president of this company. What'd you get?
I like if you have the type of table that when you finish kind of a heavy, like everyone's dead, kind of you all need like a moment to kind of process and talk through it, maybe like decompress a little bit. That's kind of a fun addendum to it of like, all right, that was really heavy. Let's have some fun with this. Like let's lighten that up a little bit.
I'm so used to you recommending Wander Home. I was thinking like Xeno Home.
Go play Wander
That
Home.
you're just some cozy, cuddly xenomorphs chilling on their new space shuttle.
I think, there are other aspects of the scenario which are never touched upon that you could expand into. For example, the Cronus, they found this on the 26th Draconis planet. You could have Wayland Yutani go back there. They could send some colonial marines back there. They could send some scientists back there. In fact, I don't know what the next book that's supposed to come out for Alien RPG. I've heard that it might be a scientist book, but that would be an amazing, scenario for them. Is now Wayland Yutani, they know where they landed. Now they're going to send some people back to, figure out what happened. And you could, again, not that I like Covenant, again, not my favorite, but you could have maybe an entire biosphere or biome of, that's been transformed by the strain, the goo, and now not only do you have neomorphs which are humanoid, but you have animal neomorphs. You've got whatever else you want to have within there, and I mean just stay away from having David be there. But other than that, I think you could expand out it wherever you want.
Giraffamorphs?
And plus, yeah,
Actually, mild spoilers, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Free League did something really cool with the Alien IP, and there are a series of novels for Alien, one of my favorite being Inferno's Fall. And if you check in a lot of these novels, there are scenarios for Alien RPG tucked into the back of it, and that the scenario itself is couched within something that happened within that novel. So if you read it, you have all the information you need to really hit the ground running. So they can be really, really fun.
Cool.
And I think the scenario is called Fallout. And I'm trying to remember the name of the novel itself. I'll probably dub this in post. The book I was trying to think of is called Colony War, but I don't actually recommend it. Inferno's Fall is much better. But there is a scenario called Fallout that actually could kind of work like this if you fudge a few details along the way that makes it more, they kind of enter into a political standoff. But for Inferno's Fall, there is a bevy of different animals that are on this jungle-like planet, and anything that comes in contact with the goo mutates into its own xenomorph. So there are giant dinosaur xenomorphs that are wandering around. It's cool as shit. I highly recommend it.
Nice. I think you could probably, if you want to leave in the Satillo and have the the pirate ship. You could probably expand from there as well if you have players that manage to escape off of it, or even then pan to the Sotillo that didn't interrupt any of this in progress, but like now you're that crew that has just been watching all of this shit go down. I don't know. Just some things you could do with that.
I mean, we were talking about, how would you run this in a convention? I mean, if I was going to run this Chariot of the Gods or something similar, I think that's how I would run it. Is instead of having the PCs be from the Montero, they're the PCs on the Sotillo, and that's where the scenario is you kind of start where they dock, and everything has just gone
To hell,
to
yeah.
shit on the Cronus, and that's where it goes from there, because that I think you could very easily do within like a 4-hour time frame.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And two, I think we'd mentioned as well is if you wanted to do more with these salvager pirates,
Mm.
you could have it where you've got some small space station. This ship is there and they've kind of cleaned it up, right? They've killed all the infected and they're just pulling it apart. And that's when the spores start hitting again, right? Is you could have a whole space station bit where people have more of these blood bursters if you're feeling like you wanted more of that but didn't quite get enough from this. We hope our deranged utterings are helpful in bringing this game to life at your table. You can join the autopsy discussion on Discord and subscribe or follow the podcast to hear more gruesome cases. Be sure to check out the show notes for links on where to find the scenario, where to find us, and other links for things like handouts, actual plays of this scenario that we recommend, Into the Darkness, and other resources. So until next time, thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators.
Where your games can die.
Or live.
On the shuttle.
There we go. Snap, snap. Latex glove sounds.
I don't even need sound effects now.
I got it covered.